A number of people have pointed out to me that in the various video lectures I've made over the past 4 or 5 years, I've only touched on Ronald Fairbairn rather briefly and in passing. And they've asked why I have not done a whole lecture on Fairbairn. I think the main answer is not that I devalue his thought, but first, his model of the mind is quite complex, and secondly, back in the 90s, mid to late 90s, I published an essay which actually it was a review essay, a review of Grotstein and Rinsley's book called Fairbairn and the Origins of Object-Rrelations. That book composed a number of essays that had been delivered at the first International Fairbairn Conference in Edinburgh, Scotland. I was in attendance at that conference and heard a number of those papers delivered, and I was gratified when they were collected and published by Grotstein and Rinsley. In that review of their book, I made an attempt to explain and at the same time revise in ways that I feel are essential Fairbairn's cartography of endopsychic structure. It's a complex model. I suppose I made it a little more complex to correct for certain problems that I found in Fairbairn's model and to elaborate on his model in certain ways. And in order to communicate all of this, I resorted to a number of charts that I'd been using in teaching Fairbairn for a number of years. And the charts show a kind of evolution. The first chart is simply to outline Fairbairn's own model, and then a second chart to attempt to correct for a problem in Fairbairn's original model, and then a third chart to add into Fairbairn's model one of Guntrip's ideas, Harry Guntrip's ideas, which he had discussed with Fairbairn, and Fairbairn had accepted as needed and beneficial additions to Fairbairn's model. And then I think there was a fourth chart, a final chart, because I felt that even with Fairbairn modified in various ways and Guntrip's contribution being added in, I felt that Melanie Klein had to be brought back in as well. So the result is this paper. It's very hard to communicate all of these details in a straight-ahead lecture such as this without something like a PowerPoint and to show these charts, and it would be a very lengthy lecture at that. In any case, this review is available in 2 places for people who have access to the PEP web, that is Psychoanalytic Electronic Publishing. The paper is available there, and I have given in the previous frame, I gave the URL for the PepWeb version, but there's also a somewhat, I think, more easily read version on my own website, so I gave the URL of that version of the paper as well. So if any of you are intrigued and want to have a more comprehensive understanding of Fairbairn and of my suggested revisions and expansions of Fairbairn, those are the links to the paper that will do that for you. Okay, so Fairbairn, as I've indicated elsewhere, was originally headed for the ministry. in the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. The church suggested that he instead should go to medical school and do psychiatry because it wanted him to establish pastoral counseling, pastoral therapy within the Church of Scotland. So he did medical school and psychiatry. And so there's this Christian background, which certainly influenced him, as it did Guntrip, who was a pastor, and as it did Winnicott, who was an Anglican. He completed psychiatric training, and for some time he served as a consultant to an agency dealing with families and children and foster families and foster children, a kind of child welfare, social work kind of agency. He was the psychiatric consultant, so he had a lot of experience there with children and families. And one of the things that caught his attention and really shaped his thinking was that over and over again he observed children who had been taken from terribly depriving and abusive homes where they were improperly fed and clothed and were physically or possibly sexually abused. They were taken out of these dysfunctional homes and removed to clean and healthy foster homes with decent foster parents who were not abusing or depriving them. And despite this, the children were begging and pleading to go home, pleading to go back to this terrible environment. And so this really seemed to Fairbairn to be out of keeping with Freud's idea of the pleasure-pain principle, that what human beings are really all about is maximizing pleasure and avoiding pain. Here, these kids were begging to go back to these very painful environments. Why? Well, because there's something more fundamental than the pursuit of pleasure and pain. In other words, there is deep attachment. Home is home, however bad it is. These children were attached to their parents, siblings, and to their home and to their parents. So attachment trumps pleasure-pain principle for Fairbairn. So already he has turned in the direction of object relations, and of course he puts this in the formula that human beings are not fundamentally pleasure-seeking, but object-seeking. Not libido-seeking, but object-seeking. Seeking an attachment with a good object. Of course, Fairbairn had been very influenced by Melanie Klein, and so he already was thinking in terms of splitting. He was thinking in terms of, as with Klein, the all-good object versus the all-bad object in the paranoid schizoid position. He added to Klein's thinking, and she accepted this addition, that when the object is split into all good and all bad, the ego that is attached to the object is also split. So he adds ego splitting to Klein's idea of splitting of the object. Klein accepts this, and this leads to her formulation of the paranoid schizoid position, where not only is there a good breast and a bad breast, but there is also a good self and a bad self. And then he proceeds to elaborate this model in his own way. On the side of the good, there is what he calls the ideal object, I-O, ideal object. And attached to the ideal object is what he called the central ego. So this is really a good parent, and attached to the good parent is the good child. And this is ideal object relating. When a seriously troubled person comes into analysis, they may try at the beginning and for some time to keep the analysis in this good realm. They make a good parent analyst of the analyst, and they try to be a good patient. This has to give way, otherwise no real analysis is going to take place. You could call this the honeymoon phase of the analysis. This is heaven. Everything's good. The analyst is good. The patient is good. Heaven. But things have to go to hell if the analysis is going to really get anywhere. Going to hell means the release of the split-off bad objects, the bad parent images and the bad child images. They're warded off initially. They're kept out of the analysis. But as Freud taught us, the repressed tends to return, and so at certain phases the bad objects start to come into the analytic work, and the analyst is no longer ideal, but at times becomes demonized, becomes a devil, and the patient is no longer presenting his good self, but all of the split-off bad selves start to emerge into the analysis as well. And this is necessary and represents progress. I mean, if it can be tolerated and contained and worked through. If it becomes so destructive that the analysis is wrecked, then obviously that's not the outcome we want to see. Okay, so the bad object, Fairbairn now begins to develop the idea that there is no one bad object but two. He splits the bad object into two components: an exciting object, which is tantalizing, teasing, and a rejecting object. So first, the exciting object, EO, tantalizes, stimulates desire, teases, and then RO, rejecting object, slams the door in your face. It makes you want it, it dangles it in front of you, and then it snatches it away. So that's the two faces of the bad object, exciting and rejecting. And attached to the exciting object is what Fairbairn called the libidinal ego. And by libidinal ego, he really means not just the child's needs and desires. He certainly does mean that, but he means the child's inflamed neediness and longing and desire. Inflamed precisely because the exciting object excites needs and desires to a greater and greater height precisely by not responding to them properly, so they become inflamed. And they become inflamed because, having been stimulated, the object then is rejecting. So attached to the exciting object is a libidinal, needy, lusting, desiring ego. And then, of course, we have the rejecting object, and I felt that Fairbairn should have posited an ego, just as he posits an inflamed libidinal ego, inflamed by the exciting object, so he should have, logically, I felt, attached to the rejecting object is a destructive ego, an angry, hateful ego. I mean, you've stimulated my desire, you've slammed the door in my face, you've made me lustful, and now you've rejected me and stimulated my hate, stimulated my envy, and then aroused my anger and hate. So I suggested that we have an ideal object and a central ego on the side of good, but on the side of bad we have an exciting object that stimulates the libidinal ego, and we have a rejecting object that stimulates hate and anger. Okay, so we've got this chart. We have a split between good and bad, and on the good side we have the ideal object and the central ego, and that's the good parent and the good child, the honeymoon phase. But when the bad objects come in, we get the exciting bad object and the libidinal ego, and we get the rejecting object and a DE, destructive ego, in response. So as this comes into the analysis, the analyst comes to be seen as exciting and rejecting. The analysis pauses for the weekend. The analyst goes on holiday. The analyst charges a fee. The analyst will not join into various forms of acting out. And therefore he is desired but is felt to be rejecting. And thus all of the inflamed libidinal need comes into the analysis, and also into the analysis comes the rage, anger that the patient feels in the face of rejection. Okay, having done that, I felt the need to bring Melanie Klein back into the picture, because there are three faces of the bad object, not just exciting, not just rejecting, but outright persecuting. A persecutory object, and attached to the persecutory object is a persecuted self. So a persecutory attacker, and in relation to that, a child who feels himself not only just excited, not only just rejected and enraged, but also outright attacked and persecuted. Okay, now we've really got a good sense of the object splitting and ego splitting that makes up what Fairbairn called endopsychic structure. I've elaborated on his model. We have an ideal object, ideal parent, and a good child. We have an exciting object and an inflamed, lustful child, needy child. We have a rejecting object, and in response to that rejection we have an angry, enraged, destructive child. And then also we have, bringing Klein back in, we have an outright persecutory object, and attached to that a persecuted child. People who know something about Fairbairn may be wondering, well, where in all of this is Fairbairn's so-called internal saboteur, which he also identified with what he called the AntiLibidinal Ego. Anti-libidinal, meaning hostile to need, hostile to desire, anti-libidinal. Now, of course, he's talking about the superego here, and therefore I find it misleading in some ways that he calls this an anti-libidinal ego. I think what he's talking about is that something that works on the level of the adult, of the object, not on the level of the ego, the child. It's a superego. And where does it fit on the chart? The internal saboteur, hostile anti-libidinal superego. Where does it fit on the chart? Well, I feel that there is no logical box on the chart to place it, because in fact what it really is the process of playing the role of the bad object, of which there are three faces. The anti-libidinal ego, which is really a superego, the internal saboteur, is me exciting myself, then rejecting myself, and then attacking and persecuting myself. Whenever I play any of these three roles, or usually it's a combination of the three, when I'm playing these roles towards myself, I am being the anti-libidinal, the internal saboteur towards myself. So I am frustrating myself, exciting myself, frustrating myself, attacking myself, and we can go on about all of the about what that looks like. Depression is self-attack. There are various ways that patients frustrate themselves and refuse to gratify themselves. How they hyperinflate their desires only to be unable to gratify them. So this is all the work of the internal saboteur, the hostile, sadistic work of the saboteur that excites and then rejects and then attacks. Okay, so here we've got a pretty interesting model. As I indicated, the analysis or a new relationship starts with IOCE, ideal object, central ego. You fall in love. You are her ideal object, her hero. She is a good, loving object who is gratifying to you, and she admires you, and you desire her, and everything is sweet in the honeymoon phase. But when the honeymoon is over, the split-off bad object and self-states start coming into the relationship, and she is now experiencing you as exciting her, but rejecting her, and we get her inflamed desire, and we get her anger in the face of rejection, and at times she may come to feel that you are simply persecuting her. And I don't mean to gender this, let's switch it around. He falls in love with her. She's the ideal object. She's the good mother he never had or never had enough. And he is idealizing her, and he's being good to her and loving, but at a certain point he starts to encounter her other side, her dark side, her exciting but rejecting and even outright attacking side, and he starts experiencing himself as needy and angry and persecuted. The relationship has gone to hell. So this happens in analysis, in any psychotherapy that's really going anywhere, and it happens all over the place when people try to have relationships with one another. An aspect of Fairbairn's anti-libidinal ego that is worth underlining, and it's implied by the very words anti-libidinal. Fairbairn sees that when a person has desires and has those desires stimulated but is not able to satisfy them, when they're systematically frustrated, he turns against his own desires. He becomes anti-libidinal. He starts holding his needs in contempt. For example, in anorexia, the need for food, the need to eat, is seen as contemptible, and one refuses one's food, one refuses to eat. The very desire for food is seen to be humiliating, is felt as humiliating. So the person becomes ashamed of his needs, even for his needs for love, his needs for attention, his needs for sex, his need for companionship. he holds himself and his needs in contempt and turns against them. And here again we have the anti-libidinal ego, turning against one's needs, inflaming them, rejecting them. One becomes self-frustrating, and one has contempt for oneself as needing in the first place. Okay, Fairbairn is getting at some pretty important things here. He's talking about repetition compulsion. People who have, say, had a very frustrating relationship with mother, and with a lot of splitting at times, and perhaps in reality mother may have been cyclothymic, very inconsistent, very moody. Mother herself may have behaved in contradictory ways, and at times she seems to be the good object, and you then are the good child, IOCE, but then she shifts, and good mother disappears to be replaced by bad mother, who is exciting, rejecting, and persecuting, and now you find yourself the inflamed, needy child, the rejected, angry child, and the persecuted child. So here's the repetition compulsion, and like those kids who wanted to leave the good foster home and get back to where they're persecuted and to the figures to whom they've become attached, so patients in their repetition compulsions seek out partners with whom they can replay the initial trauma. So one might pick a person who is very changeable, very moody, very two-faced, very split. And so here one is 30 years or 40 years later, still struggling to build the relationship with the ideal object, with the good mom, and trying to keep her good by placating or whatever. But she always turns bad. And after a bad phase, after like a big raging storm on the lake, the sun comes out and his hopes are stimulated, good mother is back, and he's going to be able to hold on to her this time. And without analysis, he never seems to wake up to the fact that she is not good mother. She never will be. She will continue to oscillate, sometimes good, sometimes bad. Seeing this pattern and seeing how one is playing it out is in itself therapeutic and relieving. A certain kind of emotional detachment becomes possible through this insight. Sometimes it leads to a breakup, a divorce, but all too often that's motivated by neurotic hope. I'm only playing this out because of this one person I've gotten attached to. If I dump that person without a lot of analysis, the chances are one is simply going to find another person to play out the same dynamic. After a honeymoon phase, things go to hell once again, and one is back in this cycle. Okay, useful theoretical concepts. Harry Guntrip proposed an additional split, which he communicated to Fairbairn, and Fairbairn accepted. And essentially the idea here is that when heaven goes to hell repeatedly, the patient can fall into a kind of despair. I can never reach the good object. Good always turns bad. And this is so painful that a part of the patient gives up. And he goes into a retreat. He goes into an underground bunker, this Guntrip called the Regressed Ego, and so we could add this to our chart. In the face of the exciting object, the person may regress, detach, turn away from the excitement, refuse to be excited, withdraw from the relationship. In the face of the rejecting object, one can avoid rejection by withdrawing from object relations, going into the regressed ego, the underground bunker. And again, in the face of outright persecution, one can retreat from the persecution into one's underground retreat. So, in the case of all three faces of the bad object, some people give up. They give up on object relating. They become schizoid patients, withdrawing from object relations into their own internal world. The schizoid is the final split. Guntrip wrote about schizoid personalities who retreat from object relating and are very hard to access, very hard to get them into therapy, very hard to get them participating in therapy. They've gone into hiding, they've withdrawn, but usually Guntrip says, they've withdrawn in the hopes of one day being reborn. One day they might find the circumstances in which they could poke their head out of their cave and see that conditions have changed, and maybe they could begin to hope and begin to believe in the possibility of love once again. But in the meantime, they're withdrawn. So this is quite useful in understanding schizoid patients who've retreated from object relating. And it's overall a very useful model to understand these essentially paranoid schizoid. This is happening pretty much on the paranoid schizoid level of functioning. When we move into the depressive position, the boundaries between these different states start to blur, become a little bit erased, and there aren't such clear splits between the different internal objects and the associated different ego states. And this blurring represents a kind of integration, a kind of reintegration. That's one way of conceiving of progress in therapy, from these unintegrated states that get played out in therapy and in all relationships, start to shift when they blur as one moves into the depressive position. Integration takes place. Fairbairn was very unusual among psychoanalytic thinkers in that, but he does have something in common with certain early psychiatric notions of psychosis and of schizophrenia. The idea was, the old psychiatric idea was that the psychotic patient has broken off relations with the real external world, real external objects, and retreated into an internal world. And Fairbairn kind of goes along with that idea. He thinks that progress in therapy should lead to virtually the disappearance of the internal world, because the patient is moving away from all of that, coming back out of the cave into reality. Now, of course, Melanie Klein would profoundly disagree with that, because Fairbairn is implying that part of the turn to the inner world is a turn away from reality into fantasy. And so he's understanding fantasy as regression, fantasy as a retreat into mere fantasy, as in flight from reality. But for Klein, fantasy is not merely a defense or the result of a defensive retreat. Fantasy is the very tissue of the mind. The mind is fantasy, and the mind works through fantasy, and creativity is very much linked with fantasy. So Kleinians and Freudians do not agree with this idea of getting rid of the internal world. They feel that the internal world is something that one cannot get rid of. It's a part of the psyche, and one ought to be able to sublimate it, transform it, use it for creative purposes, but there's no question of getting rid of it. Fairbairn is fairly unique. There's a certain Buddhist connection here too, you know, that the ego, all of these ego states and object states are illusions, and through therapy for Fairbairn, one wants to get rid of the ego, all of the egos. One wants to get rid of these illusions and come back out into reality. So it's an interesting idea, and in my paper I make connections also with Lacan here. There are certain connections here because Lacan is, like the Buddhists, is all about getting free and transcending the specular ego, which is the illusion that forms in the mirror stage and holds us captive. So there's some connections that I briefly discuss in my paper, linking Fairbairn with certain Buddhist ideas and some Lacanian ideas as well. Also in this paper, I offer a critique of Fairbairn and Guntrip, his follower, for their romanticism. Fairbairn says that, and it's odd because this is out of keeping with his Christianity. He believes that at the beginning the child is what he calls a whole, pristine, unitary self. Whole, pristine, unitary. This is the innocent infant or child before the fall. He's like Humpty Dumpty. He's whole. He hasn't fallen off the wall into pieces. Well, why does he fall? I mean, Fairbairn says everybody falls, okay? It's not that he denies the inevitability of the fall. We all fall into fragmentation. But why do we? For Fairbairn and Guntrip, we fall because of not good enough parenting. It's environmental failure. It's the parents have failed us, and that's why we fall into fragmentation. In other words, this is parent bashing. This is mother bashing, father bashing. We wouldn't fall if we'd had proper parenting, is Fairbairn's position. However, he doesn't want to sound as naive as that. After all, he also is a Christian, and this certainly is not Christianity. I mean, Christianity, in the form of St. Augustine, falls into the opposite problem. He turns the child into a sinner from day one. The infant inherits Adam's sin. This is a preposterous idea to me. I'm a follower of Kierkegaard, who reads Genesis as representing a period of infantile innocence before the fall. And there are reasons to think that it's only sometime in the second year of life, 14, 15, 16, 18 months, when the child enters into language and his eyes are opened and he knows that he is naked, i.e. he becomes self-conscious and begins to experience shame and begins to be able to lie and deceive himself and others. The idea that from day one the infant is in sin has never made any sense to me. But Fairbairn is at the other extreme. At the beginning, the child is a whole, pristine, unitary ego who would only fall into fragmentation if, but he tries to be realistic. So he says, but of course the parents always fail. They have to fail. The parents can't possibly be good enough. And that makes some people think he's not a romantic. That makes some people think that he's a realist after all, because realistically he admits that the child will always fall. Why? Because the parents can never be good enough. You see, but the thing that he will not say is that even if they were good enough, the child would fall into fragmentation. If he said that, he'd be joining the Abrahamic religions. Similarly, followers of Heinz Kohut will never say that. Even if the self-objects were perfect, the child will still fall into fragmentation. Self-psychologists will not say that. You see, they're clinging to the idea that if only the parents were good enough, but they admit that the parents can never succeed in that. Failure, self-object failure, the failure of the parents to prevent the child from falling. This idea of saying that this failure is inevitable, it's a tricky argument. Failure only makes sense if you believe in success. There's no point in calling something a failure if success is impossible. So here is Fairbairn saying, yes, the parents fail, while at the same time saying that success is impossible, that they can't succeed in not causing the child to fragment. Okay, there's a game being played here, a self-deceptive game on the part of the Cohutians and the Fairbairnians and the Guntripians. They're trying to sound realistic. The parents will inevitably have to fail because they're only human. But if they could be success, then there'd be no fall. Well, the point is, they can't achieve that success. The fall is inevitable. Even if they were successful, which they can't be, even if they were, there'd still be a fall. That they will not say. They don't want to look at the tragic, fallen nature of the human condition, which the Abrahamic religions do look at and acknowledge and recognize. We all fall. And while mommy and daddy make it worse, they can't prevent it. Even the best mommy and daddy in the world can't prevent me from entering the human condition of freedom and anxiety and awareness of death and envy and anger and rage and guilt. This is what it is to be a human. And while parents certainly make it worse, it would happen even with the best parenting imaginable, or even in the best society and culture imaginable. This is no argument against revolution. Social revolution, I believe, is fundamentally necessary in order to rid us of capitalism. Capitalism makes it much worse, but capitalism doesn't cause it. The problem is universal. Fairbairn and Guntrip are romantics, and it's odd that Fairbairn would fall into that romanticism, given his background in Christianity, and even more odd that Harry Guntrip got into this romanticism, because Guntrip was a pastor. Michael Eigen makes the mistake of describing Guntrip's psychology as a very Christian psychology. No, it's not. Guntrip is a romantic. If he posited the original innocence of the child, he'd be out of step with Christianity. Guntrip's understanding of Christianity is defective, or he radically departs from it. So in no way is Guntrip's psychology a radically Christian psychology, except in one sense. There is one sense in which, not his psychology, but he himself is radically Christian in relation to the regressed ego, the schizoid patients who've retreated from object relations in the face of frustration, and they're in their schizoid hideouts. I believe that Guntrip basically thinks of these patients as Lazarus, who's psychically died and is in a tomb, the underground retreat. And I think that Guntrip was caught up in a fantasy that he was going to resurrect Lazarus. I guess that puts Harry in the position of Jesus, the heroic therapist who can raise the dead, who can pull the psychically dead schizoid patient out of the underground cave and bring them back to life again. That's omnipotent. And of course, that's not Christian in any real sense. It's a distortion of Christianity, as is the idea that the child would remain innocent if the parents were good enough. Not the case. Okay.